History of commerce. In the year 1493, a Spanish sailor bit into a cob plucked from a field on the island we now call Cuba and did not know what he was looking at. No one in Europe knew. No one in Europe could have known. That sailor held in his hands the plant that had already fed entire empires for 7,000 years, that had built pyramids, that had sustained armies, that had been the center of religions with millions of believers, that had determined who lived and who died in half of the known world. And he simply looked at it, chewed it, and kept walking. What that sailor did not understand, and what history failed to tell correctly for centuries, is that corn was not a European discovery. It was a human creation, the most transformed, most manipulated, most constructed plant by human hands in the entire history of agriculture on this planet. It did not exist in nature the way that sailor saw it. Someone made it, and that story, the real history of corn, is one of the most extraordinary that humanity has ever starred in. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe. If you want to continue discovering these little-known stories, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Having said that, let us begin. 0,000 years ago, in the center of what is now Mexico, in the hot and dry valleys of the state of Guerrero, a group of people was doing something that no civilization had ever achieved before on that scale. They were not hunting. They were not migrating. They were choosing. Every season, every harvest, every cycle, they selected the plants that best suited them and discarded the rest. They had been doing this for generations. And at some point in that process, without knowing it, without having any word to call it, without any concept of genetics or biology, they were carrying out one of the most complex genetic engineering experiments in human history. The plant they were modifying was called Teosinte. Teosinte is a wild grass. It grows on thin stalks, produces a few small, hard seeds enclosed in a husk that is almost impossible to open, and at first glance, it bears no resemblance to what we know today as corn. If you saw it today in a field, you would walk right past it without stopping. There is nothing about it to suggest that anything edible could come out of there, let alone something capable of feeding an entire continent. And yet, those people saw it. They saw something in that plant that no one else had seen. Or perhaps they didn't see it. Perhaps they simply tried for generations, for centuries, selecting the stalks with the most seeds, selecting the plants with softer seeds, with thinner husks, with larger cobs, and at some point, between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, Teosinte stopped being Teosinte and became something new. It became corn. That which seems like a botanical detail is actually something that should make you pause, because what those communities in the Guerrero Valley achieved over several thousand years, with nothing more than observation and manual selection, is genetically so complex that for decades, modern scientists with all their tools did not understand how it had happened. In the 20th century, when geneticists began comparing the DNA of Teosinte with that of corn, they found differences so profound that for years they could not believe they were the same plant separated by thousands of years. The genetic distance between Teosinte and corn is greater than the genetic distance between a wolf and a domestic dog. What those people did was not simply cultivate a plant, it was to create a plant, build it from scratch, generation after generation, without a manual, without science, with nothing more than the accumulated observation of thousands of lives. And once it existed, corn began to do something that no other crop in the history of the Americas had done before. It began to move, not on its own, but carried by the hands of those who cultivated it, who shared it with neighboring towns, who traded it for other goods, who took it with them when they moved. Corn traveled north through Mexico, reached the southern valleys, then the coasts, then the arid northern regions. Each group that received it adapted it. Farmers in colder areas selected plants that matured faster before the frosts. Those in drier areas selected those that survived with less water. Those on the coasts selected those that tolerated humidity and salt in the air. Corn fractured into hundreds of different varieties, each perfectly adapted to its environment, each the result of centuries of local observation and selection. When Europeans arrived in the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found hundreds of different types of corn: white corn, yellow corn, purple corn, blue corn, red corn, giant corn with 3-0-centimeter cobs, ultra-fast cycle dwarf corn, flowery corn, flint corn, sweet corn, popcorn. All that diversity, all that adaptation was the result of thousands of years of human labor. But corn wasn't just a seed that traveled. It was a seed that changed everything it touched. And to understand that, you have to go to the moment when corn met a civilization that not only cultivated it, but made it the center of everything. You have to go to the Olmecs, the Mayans, and finally, the Mexicas. You have to go to the heart of what corn built. The Olmecs were the first great civilization of Mesoamerica. They flourished on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the states we now call Veracruz and Tabasco, approximately between the year 1500 and the year 400 before our era. They built urban centers, sculpted the famous colossal basalt heads, which weigh up to 40 tons and whose exact origin still generates debates. They developed early writing systems and calendars, and all of that, absolutely all of it, rested on an agricultural base, centered on corn. Without corn, the Olmecs would not exist, not in the way we know them. Corn allowed something that very few crops allow so efficiently. It allowed a part of the population to stop foraging for food and dedicate themselves to something else. When you have a crop that produces enough calories per hectare to feed more people than you need to cultivate it, suddenly you have a surplus. And a surplus is the origin of everything else. The surplus allows for people who do not work the fields, people who can be priests or warriors or artisans or administrators or builders. Corn created the conditions for social complexity to exist, not only among the Olmecs, but throughout Mesoamerica. The Mayans took this to another level. The Mayan civilization, which reached its peak between the years 200 and 900 of our era, was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. They had astronomy, mathematics, writing, monumental architecture, complex hydraulic systems, trade routes covering thousands of kilometers. And they had corn, so much corn, that in their cosmology, corn was not food. It was the substance human beings were made of. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Mayans, which is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive colonial destruction, tells that the gods tried several times to create humans. First, they made them of mud, but the mud fell apart. Then they made them of wood, but those made of wood had no soul. Finally, the gods found white corn and yellow corn. They ground them, mixed the dough with water, and from that dough, they made the first true human beings. We are corn, not as a metaphor. In Mayan cosmology, we are literally corn. Our bodies are made of corn. And that wasn't just a story. It was a way of organizing the world, of explaining why corn was sacred, why cultivating it was a religious act, why wasting it was a sin, why every grain that fell to the ground had to be picked up, The Mayans built their agriculture around corn with a precision that is still surprising. The milpa system, which combined corn, beans, and squash in the same field, was one of the smartest agricultural solutions any civilization has ever developed. It wasn't an accident. It was the accumulation of centuries of observation. Corn grows vertically and needs nitrogen from the soil. The bean climbs the cornstalk and fixes nitrogen in the soil. As it grows, the squash spreads across the ground, and its large foliage retains moisture and suppresses weeds. 3 different plants helping each other, producing more together than they would separately, and completely complementing each other nutritionally in an almost perfect way. Corn provides carbohydrates. Beans provide proteins and amino acids that corn lacks. And squash provides vitamins and minerals. Together, in the right proportions, they can sustain a healthy human life. The populations that lived off the milpa did not suffer the nutritional deficits that plagued the first Europeans who tried to live solely on corn. Without adopting Mesoamerican preparation systems, that last point is something worth stopping to fully understand. Because corn holds a secret that the Mayans and all Mesoamerican cultures knew perfectly well, and that Europeans took centuries to understand with devastating consequences. Corn contains vitamin B3, also known as niacin, but it contains it in a form that the human body cannot absorb directly. For the body to access that niacin, the corn must be processed with alkali. Mesoamerican cultures did this by soaking the corn in water with lime, in water with ash, or in water with other alkaline compounds. The process is called nixtamalization, and it chemically transforms the corn. It frees the niacin, makes the protein more digestible, increases available calcium, and reduces natural toxins. The tortilla, the tamale, the pozole, all the fundamental foods of the Mesoamerican tradition are made with nixtamalized corn. Without nixtamalization, eating corn as a primary staple for long enough causes pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that causes skin inflammation, severe digestive problems, neurological deterioration, and eventually death. When Europeans took corn to Europe and Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries as a subsistence crop, they took it without the knowledge of nixtamalization. And during the 16th to 19th centuries, pellagra devastated entire regions of southern Europe and northern Africa, where corn had become the primary food of the poor. In southern Italy, in northern Spain, in parts of Romania, in Egypt, millions of people got sick, and thousands died. European doctors for decades didn't understand why, because they saw Mesoamerican populations eating corn in abundance without those effects. They didn't understand that the secret was in the lime water, a knowledge that the peoples of Mexico had been practicing for millennia. But let's return to the American continent, because the story of corn had not yet reached its climax. The empire was missing. The Mexicas were missing. Tenochtitlan was missing. If you are liking the video, subscribe to support us. Let's continue. The Mexicas, the people the Spanish called Aztecs, arrived in the Valley of Mexico at the beginning of the 11th century of our era. They arrived as a nomadic, marginalized people with no land of their own, watching from the edges as other cultures occupied the fertile territories of central Mexico. Legend has it that their god Huitzilopochtli had promised them a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a snake. They saw it on a small swampy island in Lake Texcoco and built there. What they built in that place, in less than 200 years, was one of the largest empires the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. In the year 1519, when Hernán Cortés arrived in the Valley of Mexico, Tenochtitlan had between 200, 0, and 300, 0 inhabitants. It was larger than any city in Europe at that time, larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than Seville, which was the busiest port in Spain. In the center of that city was a market, Tlatelolco, where, according to the Spanish chroniclers themselves, over 000 people gathered to trade every 5 days. The Spaniards, who saw it for the first time, said they had never seen anything like it anywhere in the world. And in that market, in that beating heart of the largest urban center in the Western Hemisphere, at that time, the most important product, the most present, the one found in the most forms and varieties, was corn. The agricultural system that sustained Tenochtitlan and the Mexica Empire was extraordinary. Lake Texcoco wasn't just the ground the city was built on. It was also one of the most efficient agricultural production systems in the pre-Columbian world. The Chinampas, which Europeans would call floating gardens, were rectangular platforms built in the shallow waters of the lake, made of alternating layers of lake mud and vegetation. Stabilized with interconnected tree roots along navigable canals, a well-maintained Chinampa could produce between 7 and 8 harvests a year. Not 2, not 3, 8. The constantly moist soil, constantly fertilized with lake mud and organic waste from the city, was extraordinarily fertile. The Chinampas were a continuous production system in a world where most civilizations relied on 1 or 2 annual harvests and the whims of the rain. Corn was the center of that production. Corn fed the builders, the warriors, the priests, the artisan, the merchants. Corn arrived as tribute from every corner of the empire, stored in the great state granaries, distributed in times of scarcity. Corn was the invisible currency that made everything else turn. The Mexicans also understood corn in its ritual dimensions, with an intensity that few civilizations have devoted to any food. They had corn gods. Several of them. Centeotl was the god of corn, son of the earth and the sun. Chicomecoatl was the goddess of abundance, always depicted with cobs in her hands. Every phase of corn cultivation, from soil preparation to harvest, was accompanied by rituals, offerings, ceremonies. The first cob of every harvest wasn't eaten. It was offered. Mexica farmers asked the earth for permission before plowing and gave thanks after harvesting. Not because they were superstitious in the derogatory sense of the word, but because they had understood, after thousands of years of total dependence on that plant, that the relationship between humans and corn was reciprocal, that the earth could stop giving if something wasn't returned to it. That balance mattered. And then came the breaking point. On November 11, 1519, Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. He didn't arrive alone. He arrived with about 500 Spanish soldiers, with Tlaxcalan allies who hated Mexico rule, and with something invisible he carried with him without knowing it: diseases. Primarily smallpox, but also measles and typhus. Diseases against which the American populations had no immunological defense because they had never faced them. The first major smallpox outbreak in central Mexico began in the year 1520, while Cortés and his men had been temporarily expelled from Tenochtitlan before the Spanish returned to take the city for good. Smallpox had already killed tens of thousands of people within its walls. It had killed the Tlatoani-Cuitláhuac, Moctezuma's immediate successor. 80 days after he assumed power, it had disoriented the city's defense, disrupted the chain of command, and sowed terror in a population that didn't understand why their bodies erupted in sores and their neighbors died without any visible enemy attacking them. Tenochtitlan fell on August 13, 1521, and with it fell the system that had sustained millions of people. The Chinampas were abandoned, the granaries were looted. The tribute network that moved corn from the fields to the distribution centers was broken. Hunger reached regions that had not known hunger for generations. What followed in the subsequent decades was one of the most severe demographic catastrophes in human history. Estimates vary among researchers, but there is a general consensus that the population of central Mexico, which in the year 1519 could have been between 15 and 25 million people, had plummeted to between 1 and 3 million by the year 1600. In less than a century, between 60% and 90% of the population had disappeared, not just from military conquest, but mostly from diseases, the collapse of agricultural systems, forced labor in mines and plantations, and the starvation that followed the destruction of food distribution networks. The cornfields that had fed empires were left without hands to cultivate them. The knowledge of when to sow, how to prepare the soil, what varieties to plant in what conditions, and how to store grain to survive bad years. All that knowledge accumulated over thousands of years began to be lost, along with the people who carried it. And while that was happening in the Americas, corn was beginning its second life. Its global life. Christopher Columbus brought corn to Spain after his first voyage in the year 1492. At first, the Spanish didn't quite know what to do with it. They called it panizo, confused it with other cereals, and looked at it with a mix of curiosity and distrust with which Europeans viewed almost everything coming from the New World. But corn has an advantage that no European cereal has to the same extent. It adapts to almost any climate. It grows in the tropics and in temperate regions. It grows with abundant rain and with very little rain. It grows at high altitudes and on the coasts. It produces more calories per hectare than wheat, barley, or rye, and it grows faster. A cornfield can produce in 3 or 4 months what a wheat field produces in 6 or 8. For European farmers, relying on unpredictable harvests and cyclical famines, that was almost miraculous. In less than 50 years after its arrival in Spain, corn was already in Portugal. In less than 100 years, it was in Italy, the Balkans, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China. The speed at which corn spread across the world in the 16th and 17th centuries is astounding even from today's perspective. No other American crop, not the potato, not the tomato, not cacao expanded so quickly or so far. And the reason is simple. It worked. In regions of Africa, where the climate did not allow for wheat but did for rice, corn arrived as an alternative that produced more with less. In regions of Asia, where demographic pressure made rice lands insufficient, corn allowed new fields to be opened on slopes and areas unsuitable for rice. In parts of Europe, where wheat harvests regularly failed, corn became the salvation of the poor. Literally, the salvation. Not metaphorically. In China, corn probably arrived via Portuguese trade routes around the year 1530. And over the next 150 years, it transformed the country's demographics. The mountainous regions of inland China, which until then were sparsely populated because the poor and steep soils did not allow for rice cultivation, became populated with corn. Millions of people were able to farm and feed themselves in areas where no one could live before. Historians attribute a significant part of the Chinese population growth between the 15th and 19th centuries, which doubled and then tripled the country's number of inhabitants, to corn and other American crops like the potato. The demographic history of China is partly the history of corn. The same thing happened in Africa. Corn arrived on the African continent in the 16th century through Portuguese ports on the west and east coasts. African farmers adopted it with surprising speed because its advantages were obvious. In regions where sorghum and millet were the traditional cereals, corn produced more. in less time, but corn in Africa also had a darker dimension, a much darker one, because corn arrived in Africa at the same time the enslaved people trade was at its peak, and European and African slave traders soon discovered that corn was the perfect food for the ships crossing the Atlantic. It was calorie-dense, easy to store, and cheap to produce in large quantities. Records from ships engaged in the transatlantic slave trade show that corn was the primary food used in the attempt to keep people alive during the weeks of the crossing. 3 times a day, boiled or raw corn. Yes, during 6 or 10 weeks of crossing, in conditions that have no adequate name in any language. Corn was present in one of the greatest crimes of modern history, not as a victim or an executioner, but as a witness, as the food that sustained the lives of millions of people, while those same people were treated as cargo. And on the other side of the Atlantic, those enslaved people arrived on a continent where corn was also the center of everything. The plantations of the South, in what is now the United States, those in the Caribbean, those in northeastern Brazil, all depended on corn as the staple food for the enslaved labor force, and they also depended on the agricultural knowledge those people brought with them. Many of the West African regions, where most of the enslaved people came from, had decades or centuries of experience growing corn. They knew the crop rotations, they knew the soils, they knew the plant's rhythms. That knowledge also traveled on the ships and was applied in the fields of the New World. In the northern part of the continent, native cultures of North America had received corn from Mesoamerica centuries before. The peoples of the Southwest, the ancestors of the Hopi, Zuni, and Navajo, grew corn in the deserts of what is now Arizona and New Mexico, using sophisticated irrigation techniques that allowed them to produce harvests in one of the most arid environments on the continent, the Haudenosaunee. The Iroquois Confederacy of the Northeast grew corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters in the forests of the Great Lakes and the Hudson River valleys, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Choctaw in the southeast. Almost all the agricultural cultures of North America had corn at the center of their food economy. When European colonists arrived on the North Atlantic coasts in the 16th and 17th centuries, those who survived largely survived thanks to corn. The story of the Plymouth colony, that of the Mayflower Pilgrims in the year 1620, includes the moment when the colonists discovered stores of corn buried by the Wampanoag to preserve them through the winter. The colonists took that corn without permission. Without it, they probably would not have survived their first American winter. Tisquantum, the Wampanoag man who spoke with the colonists and taught them to plant corn in the spring of the year 1621, laid the foundation for the first successful European harvest in New England. The celebration Americans know as Thanksgiving has at its center a table where corn, in one form or another, is never missing. That is not a coincidence. It is a memory. As European settlers expanded westward across the North American continent during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, corn went with them. It was the quintessential frontier crop. It could be planted in newly cleared virgin soils without the skills, without the preparation required by wheat. It produced enough in the first year to feed a family and save seed for the next. The settlers learned from indigenous peoples to plant in mounds, to companion plant with beans and squash, and to use the stalks as livestock feed. Corn was so central to the economy of early European settlements in North America that in many regions it was used as currency. Taxes were paid in corn. Land was bought with corn. Services were paid for with corn. The dollar did not yet exist, but corn did. And while corn was becoming the foundation of the agricultural economy of Eastern North America, something else was happening in the South. A transformation that in the 20th century would change the way the entire world eats, drinks, and lives. During the early centuries of European colonization of North America, corn was eaten directly. People ate it in tortillas if you were Mesoamerican, in cornbread if you were a southern U.S. Zetla, in polenta if you were from northern Italy, in ugali if you were from East Africa. Corn went from the field to the stomach with few intermediate steps. But in the 19th century, something changed. Corn began to be produced in quantities that far exceeded what people could directly eat. Railroads opened the Great Plains of the central United States to large-scale farming, agricultural machinery. The mechanical seeder, the harvester, reduced the number of people needed to produce large quantities of grain. And corn, with its high yield per hectare, began to pile up. The surplus was immense, and someone had to figure out what to do with it. The first answer was whiskey. In the mountainous regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, farmers discovered in the late 18th century that fermented corn produced a distillate that could be sold at much higher prices than raw grain. Bourbon, the American corn whiskey, was born out of that practical need to convert heavy, hard-to-transport surpluses into a concentrated, lightweight, high-value product. A sack of corn was converted into several liters of whiskey, much easier to transport on horseback along the mountain trails that led to the markets. Corn whiskey was so important to the economy of early American states that when the federal government tried to tax it in the year 1791, Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first great constitutional crisis in the United States. President George Washington had to mobilize nearly 13,000 national militia soldiers to quell it, all because of corn turned into alcohol. But alcohol was only the beginning. The 19th century brought industrialization, and with it, the possibility of processing corn in ways that had never before been possible. Cornstarch became a fundamental industrial ingredient. Corn oil began to be used in cooking and in product manufacturing. Ground corn became feed for pigs and cattle on an unprecedented scale. And there lies the turning point that very few people understand. Most of the corn produced in the world today is not eaten directly. It is turned into something else. It is turned into meat, milk, eggs. It is turned into fuel. It is turned into plastics and adhesives. It is turned into the high fructose syrup that sweetens soft drinks and processed foods. Today in the United States, the world's largest corn producer, less than 2% of the corn produced is consumed directly as food by people. The rest is transformed. The 20th century was the century when corn ceased to be a crop and became an industry, and the breaking point, the moment everything changed, occurred in the second half of the century with the arrival of what was called the Green Revolution and the development of hybrid corn. Hybrid corn is the result of crossing two pure genetic lines of corn to produce a seed that, in the first generation, has a much higher yield than its parents. A phenomenon called hybrid vigor. Mesoamerican farmers had observed something similar for millennia by selecting their best plants. But the industrial hybrids of the 20th century took that principle to an extreme never seen before. Yields multiplied. In the year 1930, the average corn yield in the United States was around 1,500 kilograms per hectare. Today, it exceeds 11,0 kilograms per hectare. 7 times more. Global corn production went from about 200 million tons in the 1950s to over 1.2 billion tons today. It is the most produced cereal on the planet, surpassing wheat and rice. The world produces over 1 billion tons of corn every year. But industrial hybrids have a characteristic that fundamentally differentiates them from the corn that Mesoamerican communities and all the cultures that later adopted it grew for 8,000 years. The hybrid seed, if saved and replanted, does not produce plants with the same yield. Hybrid vigor disappears in the second generation. To get the same yield the following year, you have to buy new seeds every year. That radically transformed the relationship between the farmer and the seed. Forward 000 years. The farmer saved their best cobs, selected the seeds, and planted them the following year. The seed belonged to the farmer. It was their accumulated work, their knowledge, their independence. With the industrial hybrid, the seed belongs to the company that developed it. The farmer buys it, plants it, and the next year has to buy it again. The dependency is not just economic, it is technical. It is biological. Without access to the seed market, the farmer cannot produce. This had worldwide consequences that are still unfolding today. In the 1960s, 60s, and 80s of the 20th century, with the support of international organizations and Western governments, hybrid corn varieties expanded to Mexico, Central America, Africa, and Asia. Production increased. Hunger decreased in some regions, but at the same time, thousands of local corn varieties that had been selected over centuries to adapt to specific conditions, which carried the agricultural knowledge of countless generations in their DNA, were abandoned. Farmers who adopted the hybrid stopped planting their local varieties, and when they stopped planting them, those varieties disappeared. Not immediately, but progressively. Mexico, which is the center of origin of corn, and for centuries, the repository of the plant's greatest genetic diversity, lost a significant proportion of its traditional varieties in the last half-century. The plant that built empires is being homogenized by the same industrialization that made it the most produced crop in the world. And at the center of that homogenization is something that virtually everyone in the industrialized world consumes every day without knowing it. High fructose corn syrup. In the year 1971, Japanese researchers developed an enzymatic process that converted cornstarch into a liquid syrup with a high fructose content, sweeter than cane sugar and much cheaper to produce. In the 1970s and 80s, large soft drink manufacturers in the United States, pushed by government corn subsidies that made the syrup artificially cheap, began substituting cane sugar with corn syrup in their products. By the year 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had completed the transition in their primary markets. Today, high fructose corn syrup is in a massive proportion of processed foods sold globally, in soft drinks, industrial breads, ketchup, dressings, breakfast cereals, sweetened dairy products, cookies, and ice cream. The average consumer in an industrialized country consumes tens of grams of corn syrup every day without knowing it, because it appears on labels under names that are not always immediately recognizable. The scientific debate over the health effects of high fructose corn syrup has been lengthy and at times heated. What does exist is a temporal correlation that is hard to ignore. The dramatic increase in obesity rates in the United States and other countries where high fructose corn syrup was massively adopted temporally coincides with its large-scale introduction into the diet. The obesity rate in the United States was around 15% in the year 1970. Today, it exceeds 42%. Not everything can be attributed to corn syrup, but the coincidence cannot be ignored either. Corn also became the center of the fuel debate in the 21st century. Corn ethanol, the alcohol produced by fermenting the grain, became a heavily politically supported alternative to fossil fuels in the United States. In the 2000s, the federal government established mandates requiring ethanol to be blended into gasoline. Midwestern corn farmers were given a vast new market. Corn production skyrocketed even further. But corn ethanol also has costs. It produces less energy per liter than gasoline. Producing it requires energy, fertilizers, and water. and diverting huge amounts of corn into automobile gas tanks, instead of human or animal food supplies, affects food prices, which impacts the poorest above all. In the years 2007 and 2008, when international food prices spiked, part of that increase was attributed to the diversion of corn for ethanol production. In countries where tortillas, ugali, or polenta form the staple diet of the poorest, that price increase translated into real hunger. Today, corn is omnipresent in a way that its creators, those people in the Guerrero valleys 8,000 years ago, could not have imagined in any known form of thought. It is in car fuel. It is in packaging plastics. It is in adhesives. It is in medications as an excipient. It is in cosmetics. It is in paper. It is in paints. It is in pet food. It is in the livestock feed that produces the meat and dairy consumed by billions of people. It is in almost everything modern life touches. In one way or another, if it were possible to trace all the products in an average grocery store in an industrialized country and see how many of them contain corn in some form, the result would shock almost everyone. The proportion exceeds 70% by many estimates. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because corn, over 8,000 years of relating to humans, has become indispensable. And yet, in the place where it was born, in Mexico, in Mesoamerica, in the valleys and mountains where Teosinte was turned into corn by anonymous hands that will never appear in any history book with proper names, corn remains something that no production statistic or market analysis can fully capture. It is still the substance of which humans are made. It remains at the center of the worldview of millions of people who grow it with the same basic logic as their ancestors. Observe, select, save, plant. The indigenous communities of Mexico that still maintain their native heirloom corn varieties, that still nixtamalize with lime, that still make tortillas by hand, that still ask the earth for permission before sowing, are not doing something quaint or archaic. They are preserving the most profound knowledge humanity has about that plant. Knowledge that is not in any genetic database or agronomic manual. Knowledge that lives only in practice, in memory, in the hands that know the difference between a good cob and one that should not be planted. In the year 1994, Mexico signed the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Canada. NAFTA. One of the most documented effects of that treaty was the massive influx of subsidized yellow corn from the United States into the Mexican market. At prices Mexican farmers could not compete with, millions of peasants, especially in the poorest and most indigenous regions of the country. In Oaxaca, Guerrero, Chiapas, in the valleys where corn has 8,000 years of uninterrupted history, were no longer able to sell their corn at prices that covered their costs. Many abandoned the fields, migrating to the cities or north to the United States. The milpas their families had cultivated for generations were left uncultivated or converted to other uses. The country that invented corn began importing corn from the country that industrialized it. The story of corn is not a story of triumph or defeat. It is a story of continuous transformation of a plant that started as a grass with no obvious value and became the axis around which much of human nutrition on the planet revolves. It is the story of thousands of generations of people who applied their intelligence, observation, and labor to create something that did not exist. It is the story of empires built on cornfields and of destroyed empires that left those fields deserted. It is the story of a knowledge that traveled the world in the hands of enslaved people and in the pockets of sailors who did not even understand what they were carrying. It is the story of a plant that was sacred for millennia and that today is an industrial input, a number on a spreadsheet, a raw material whose price is fixed on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And it is also the story of the communities that still treat it as what it always was, as the origin, as the center, as the substance of which we are made. That Spanish sailor, who in the year 1493 bits into a cob on a Caribbean island and didn't know what he held in his hands, is not so different from most of us today. We live surrounded by corn. We eat it every day in forms we do not recognize. It fills our car tanks, coats our food packaging, sweetens our soft drinks, and hardly any of us see it. Hardly any of us know that what we are looking at is the result of 8,000 years of human labor, the most transformed, most traveled, most ubiquitous crop in history. The plant that an anonymous group of people built from scratch in the hot valleys of central Mexico, and that ended up feeding the entire world, the food that changed America, and then changed everything else.